want to say another word of good morning and welcome. My name is Matt Stone. I'm one of the pastors here and honored to be in worship with you this morning as we continue our series in Ruth, where this is the second week. If you missed last week, I hope you'll get a chance to go back and listen to Pastor Sean's message. Did a phenomenal job of introducing us to Ruth's story and bringing us along. We're going to pick that story up. But if you missed last week, here's just a brief recap, because really what we want to do in this series, sometimes you start a series, sometimes we start a sermon series with some kind of practical goals in mind, and then we look for, okay, how do we see this show up in Scripture? Sometimes it's the opposite direction. Sometimes we say, okay, we think this passage or this book in Scripture has something really valuable for us to listen to and to hear and to learn from. And so what is it that we hear from that? This is one of those series. So we just want to listen to what's happening in Ruth's life and Naomi's life and learn what is it that God would ask of us in response to that. So here's where we left off last week. We heard about Naomi, and Naomi is from Bethlehem. She leaves Bethlehem in Israel. A blessed woman. She leaves with a husband, Elimelech, with two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. That's the way I say them. I know Sean says them different, but well, I'll let you make the decision about who's right. Mahlon and Chilion is the right way to say it, but it's whatever. So Naomi, with her family, leaves Bethlehem. There's a famine. They go to a place called Moab. We're going to talk more about that this morning. While they're in Moab, Naomi's husband Elimelech dies. Her two sons also die. She's left with her daughters-in-law. She decides to return to Israel. One of her daughters-in-law, Orpah, decides, I don't think so. And one of her daughters-in-law, Ruth, says, okay, I'll go with you. And so they make the journey back. But when Ruth and Naomi return to Bethlehem, they are not returning in the same condition in which they left, right? Naomi left full and she comes back empty. Naomi left Bethlehem as a family and she comes back as an unfamily. Her family's been unmade by the events that have happened in her life. She left named Naomi, which means pleasant. She returns, she changes her own name to Mara, which means bitterness. When she returns, when Naomi and Ruth return, the question that they believe they've already asked, or that they've already answered is, has God abandoned us? And they think the answer is absolutely. They think God has absolutely abandoned us. At least Naomi believes that God has abandoned them. And so the question that we ask of this text, is that true? Is that what happened in this story? Is that the meaning that we can take from the challenges that we face in our own life? Is it true that when bad things happen in our life, is that a sign that God has left us on our own, that God has abandoned us? Is that really how the world works? So that's where we left the story off last week, and I love in particular what Pastor Sean did in helping us see the difference between perception and reality. Last week was dominated by Naomi's perception of what was happening. This week, we're going to begin to see reality take front and center stage. At the end of chapter 1, what we hear is, well, let me just read it to you because I think it's kind of funny, and I want you to remember this. Naomi returned together with Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, who came back with her from the country of Moab. Okay, we get it. Moabite. Okay, we got it. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. That's the last sentence of chapter 1. And I love that because that feels like an awfully random detail. And I don't know who the author is. Dear Phil, why are you telling us that it's the barley harvest? Feels like one of those things that just does not matter. And I can't wait to show you next week that really does matter. And so remember that, tuck that away, bookmark it. We're going to come back to why the barley harvest matters. But as a hint, I'll tell you, the barley harvest in ancient Israel was sometime around April. So if you know stories that are shared in ancient Israel in the March-April timeframe, then you have some idea of where we're headed next week. So just keep it in mind. Then as chapter 2 begins, what we hear is that Naomi and Ruth are desperate. And so the author again says, Ruth the Moabite says to Naomi. And at this point, I'm getting a little tired of it, frankly. Like Ruth the Moabite, she's from Moab. They went to Moab, they came back from Moab. Ruth's the Moabite, Ruth's from Moab, Ruth's the Moabite, Ruth's from Moab. We get it. Like 6 different times in this chapter and in chapter 1, we hear Ruth the Moabite. And I love in particular the way the NIV It says this, sometimes I use the NIV Archaeological Study Bible. It's fascinating. But the NIV says the Moabitess, which adds an air of villainy. It's like very sinister, Ruth the Moabitess. And if you look very, very closely in the Hebrew, here's what it says. Ruth the Moabite, yuck. That's what it says. Yuck. We don't like the Moabites. That's why we say it over and over again, because we don't like the Moabites. And here's why, well, I'm going to give you one reason why we don't like the Moabites. It goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 19. If you go back and read that chapter, good luck to you. But you'll find that there's the story of Lot, who has lost his wife. I'll let you read how. And Lot is left with his two daughters. His two daughters would like to have children, and so they do. They have a child named Moab, and that child is Lot's grandson and son. We don't like the Moabites. Yuck. That's the kind of people they come from. You hear the vitriol and hatred throughout the Old Testament about the Moabites, and we don't want any part of it. The problem with Naomi is what has happened to her. When she comes back to Bethlehem, Naomi is on the outside because she has become an unfamily. Right? It is clear by what has happened in Naomi's life that God has removed his blessing from her, that she is no longer a pleasant person. It is what has happened to Naomi that puts her on the outside. That's not true for Ruth. It's not what Ruth has done. It's not what has happened to Ruth. It is who Ruth is that puts her on the outside. It is who Ruth is that keeps her very much on the edge of their community, because everyone there, including Ruth, we're going to see, knows that she doesn't belong here. Yuck. The Moabites. She's a Moabite. She's from Moab. We don't want any part of her. So that's how chapter 2 begins. And Ruth says, look, I'm not going to be paralyzed by grief. I'm not going to be paralyzed by my pain. If we don't get some food, we're going to die. So I'm going to go out and look for some food. And Naomi's response, at least the tone of it for me, feels like, okay, go ahead. That's kind of Naomi's response. Okay, whatever, go ahead. Naomi's given up. At least that's the way it feels to me. Naomi has given up. Ruth is not done yet. Ruth goes out and she finds a field that she can gather some of the leftovers of the barley harvest from, right? So harvesters would go through, they would reap the harvest, and then there would be virtually crumbs left behind, a few sheaves left behind that people could come and gather. But here's the fascinating part for me. That practice of gathering food behind the harvesters wasn't an accidental practice. When Ruth goes out to gather behind the harvesters, she's taking advantage of God's plan from the beginning. Because God's plan from the beginning was this is fascinating. Go back and read Deuteronomy chapter 24, start somewhere around verse 18. What you're going to hear is God say stuff. This is just one example. He says it over and over again. God says stuff like this throughout the Old Testament. He says, hey, don't forget, Israel, y'all were slaves in Egypt one time. You know what it's like to have nothing. You know what it's like to be oppressed. You know what it's like to be forgotten. And because you were slaves once in Egypt, and I brought you out of that into the promised land, because you know what that's like, when you see an orphan, when you see a widow, when you see a resident alien, care for them. And the way that you're going to care for them, God's very specific. I love the specificity of this. God's very specific in how he wants Israel to care for widows, aliens, and orphans, because these are the most vulnerable people. He says, what you do is when you are harvesting your fields, don't gather every speck of grain from that field. Leave some behind. You don't need every stalk of grain. Leave some behind so that those who have no one to care for them, those who have no one to provide for them, can come behind you and gather food for themselves and provide for themselves. This was God's plan for those who are most vulnerable. So when Ruth leaves Naomi and goes into the fields, this is what she's relying on. Now, it's not a commandment. Israel doesn't have to do this. It depends on whether the owner of the field will allow that practice to go on. God has expressed his hope. He says, I hope, well, he doesn't say it quite like this, but this is how I read it. God says, this is my best hope for you, Israel, that this is how you will care for those who are vulnerable among you. So Ruth goes into the field and she begins gathering behind the harvesters. And at some point, the owner of that field shows up, and his name is Boaz, and he's of the house and family and tribe of Elimelech. Just file that away, keep it in mind here in a little while. And Boaz asks his foreman, the guy that's in charge, he says, hey, who's that girl? Who is that girl right there? And his servant says, oh, that's Ruth, the Moabite. Yuck. And then he doubles down, from the country of Moab. We're like, for goodness sake, you people, give it up. We get it. I promise, we get it. That's Ruth the Moabite. And here's the deal. She showed up early this morning. She asked if she could reap behind our harvesters. We said yes. So she's been here from sun up to midday, working with no food and no water. And now we can start to paint a little bit clearer picture of who Ruth is. Pastor Sean introduced us to Ruth. We heard last week about Ruth's loyalty, about her faithfulness to Naomi, about her willingness to go where Naomi goes, and for Naomi's people to be her people. But now we add to that a kind of extraordinary work ethic. Remember that this is a person who's still mourning the loss of her husband. So she would have been, in all likelihood, clothed in all black garments, working all day with no food and water, right? This is somebody who is grinding it out, working hard to try to provide just enough food for herself and for her mother-in-law. We get a picture of the worthiness of Ruth as the story goes on. And then we reach a kind of fork in the road. How is it that Boaz is going to respond? Boaz has two choices. He doesn't have to allow Ruth to continue gathering grain in his field. That's his grain, and she's a Moabite. We've been over that. We don't like her. So Boaz doesn't have to let her do that. But listen to Boaz's response. It's fascinating. This is in Ruth chapter 2, verse 8. Then Boaz says to Ruth, now listen, my daughter. That's not a subtle change of title. We went in the span of 2 verses from Ruth the Moabite, yuck, to listen, Ruth, my daughter. You are one of us. I am claiming that you belong here. Listen, Ruth, my daughter, don't go glean in another field or leave this field, but keep close to my young woman. Keep your eyes on the field that's being reaped and follow behind them. I've ordered the young men not to bother you, and if you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn. What Boaz begins to do is to provide, and provide not just enough. What Boaz does not do is say, what's the least I can give to this woman and still call myself a nice guy? Instead, what we begin to see from Boaz is that he goes above and beyond. He says, look, you don't have to go anywhere else. You can glean from these fields as long as you want to or as long as you need to. I've provided for your protection. I made sure that my servants, who some of them aren't the best kinds of guys, they're not going to touch you. They're not going to bother you. I've provided for your protection, and if you get thirsty, go drink what they drew up. And that's a sneaky one because the expectation would have been for Ruth to draw her own water from a well. But instead, what Boaz has done is to say, you don't even have to do that work. I'm going to give you water. I'm going to give you food. And you can feel Ruth's confusion. This is in verse 10. Then Ruth falls prostrate with her face on the ground and said to Boaz, why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me when I'm a foreigner? Ruth knows the score, by the way. Right? Ruth knows who she is. Ruth knows where she is. Ruth knows she has no standing and no value in this place. And that's her question. Why are you doing this, Boaz? Listen to his response. It's going to move from a simple response into a profound blessing that he pronounces over her. This is fascinating. All that you have done for your mother-in-law, this is Boaz's response, all that you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me. I've heard your story, Boaz says, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before, and now he moves into a blessing. I've heard your story, Boaz says. I know the pain that you've been through. I know where you are in life. So may the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. The blessing that he pronounces over Ruth is that she has found favor in God's eyes, not just his own eyes. Boaz is the first person to see Ruth, right? Naomi doesn't see Ruth. All Naomi sees is her own pain and her own suffering. Naomi doesn't see Ruth's pain or Ruth's suffering. Naomi doesn't see who Ruth is. And the people who are in Bethlehem definitely don't see Ruth. All they see is where Ruth is from. Boaz is the one who sees Ruth, sees her pain, and invites her into God's own story. You can hear the dignity, the respect, the honor, the love, the provision, the protection that Boaz offers this woman who he has no obligation to. It is one of the most profound examples, I think, of grace and generosity that doesn't involve God in Scripture. Or maybe it does. We'll see. We'll see. After that, this is what Ruth says. She says, "May I continue to find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me. You have spoken kindly to your servant, even though I am not one of your servants." And you can almost hear Ruth say, hey, I don't know about the whole God thing. I don't know about the whole refuge under God's wings thing, but thank you. Thank you for your kindness. Thank you for your comfort. Think about the last time somebody has been kind to Ruth. In the midst of her suffering and pain, you can feel the gratitude just pouring out of her. She may not be sure about the whole God of Israel thing yet, but she is grateful for the kindness and love that Boaz has already offered her. They go on doing some more work, and when it comes to the lunchtime, Boaz invites Ruth to his own table, which is culturally entirely inappropriate. But he invites Ruth to his table because he wants Ruth to have enough to eat. It says that he heaps up food on her plate. When do you think the last time Ruth ate a full meal was? When do you think the last time was that she ate more than just enough to not die of starvation? And Boaz is heaping up food on her plate for her. And then he tells his servants, he says, hey, Ruth is going to be in our fields. You touch her, I'm going to get you. It's not exactly, that's maybe the Texan translation. You touch her, I'm going to get you. He provides not only for her sustenance, he provides for her protection as well. Boaz cares deeply about this woman that nobody else cares about, that nobody else even sees. Boaz is caring for and seeing for her needs. And so she finishes gleaning. It says that she gleans about an ephah of grain, which is a huge amount. Ruth obviously has worked incredibly hard, and she takes that home along with the leftovers from lunch. She takes all of that home. That's enough grain, by the way, for about a month. So in one day, she gathers enough barley for a month's worth of meals. And when she's coming home, she meets her mother-in-law, and this is down in verse 19 in chapter 2. Her mother-in-law said to Ruth, "Where'd you glean today?" You can hear the disbelief. Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. And she told her mother-in-law, who she'd been working with, she said, "The name of the man with whom I've worked today is Boaz." Now listen to Naomi's response. It just makes you want to really... This is Naomi's response. Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." And Naomi also said, "The man is a relative." She's talking about Boaz. "The man's a relative of ours. He's one of our nearest kin." And you just want to say to Naomi, are you kidding me? Like what? If you knew he was there, why didn't you ask for some help? If you knew he was in town, why not just pop over and say, "Hey, Boaz, could I, have a couple eggs? Would it be okay if you shared some steaks with me? Why did you not ask for help, Naomi? Why did Ruth just have to go and randomly, by chance, just happen to begin gleaning in Boaz's fields? I'm very frustrated with Naomi until I remember what some of you know by experience. Until I remember that pain, grief, abandonment, shame, these things have a way of uniquely blinding us to the world around us. They draw our gaze from the horizon ahead or the heavens above to the dirt right in front of us, and we can't see how to get out of it because that's all we see is our own pain, grief, suffering, and sense of abandonment. This is part of the human condition. This is what happens. Our vision is narrowed by those kinds of challenges. And so when I'm tempted to be frustrated with Naomi, I have to remember, wait a minute, this is exactly what we all do as well. When things get hard, we can't see as clearly what God might be up to around us. And so Naomi finally begins to see again, maybe my story's not done. Maybe hope is not actually lost. And does she begin to see that hope because God has provided miraculously for her? Well, yes and no. God didn't provide manna from heaven for Ruth and Naomi, but God did provide Boaz. God did provide guidance to his people about how to care for those who are on the margins, and Boaz was the one who hears God's hope for him and responds. Boaz is the one who remembers what God did for Israel and treats Ruth in kind. This is ultimately a story, I think, at least at this point, this is a story of seeing and being God's provision in the world around us. It's a story of seeing God's provision. We talked a little bit about this last week, that the perception was different from the reality for Naomi, right? So part of what Naomi is beginning to do is to see reality, not just how she perceived the world to be, but she's beginning to see what actually is in front of us. And it makes me want to think about, how can I see what God is up to even when I'm in those kind of Naomi and Ruth places in my life? One of the ways that I think we can see God's provision for us is the simple practice of gratitude. And there's so much literature out there right now about gratitude, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, other than to say this: gratitude has a unique way of reorienting our vision. It expands the scope of our vision. If grief, pain, and suffering narrow what we can see, gratitude expands what we can see. It lifts our eyes from the dirt in front of us to the horizon in front or the heavens above, because we remind ourselves that there is plenty yet to be grateful for. Gratitude reminds us of those things. I think the other thing that we see from Ruth and Naomi is that keep your people close, right? Naomi tried to isolate herself. She tried to get rid of Orpah and Ruth both. She was successful with Orpah, but not with Ruth. If she had gotten rid of Ruth, if she had truly been isolated, would Naomi have been able to see God's provision through Boaz? Maybe. And maybe not. Keep your people close. In times of challenge, resist the urge to hold them at arm's length. And by the way, if you don't have people to hold close, if you don't have people holding you close, that's what we're doing here. This is our heart for you. This is our desire for you, is to be the kind of church, the kind of community that holds each other close, particularly in times of challenge. It's not only a story of seeing God's provision, it's also a story of being God's provision. I want to read to you a line from a book by James Keenan. The book's title is A History of Catholic Theological Ethics, which I did not read because it sounds very boring. But there is a line that just arrested my attention that I heard a while back. James Keenan says this. He says, "Sin is the failure to bother to love." Sin is the failure to bother to love. It's as though if Boaz had said, "Who is that girl? I'm very important. I don't have time to deal with her. Why is she wasting my time? I'm very important. I have many important people to talk to and many important tasks to take care of. I can't be bothered with her. James Keenan says that's sin. When we can't be bothered to love, this is what sin looks like. And I'm not sure that that's a comprehensive definition of sin, but I sure like the way it cuts to the heart of it. He goes on, he says, sins of omission, things that we don't do, are as important as the sins of commission, the things that we do, that we usually obsess over. Sin is not so much about our weaknesses, but about the strengths that we did not. Oh, listen to this. This cuts me. Sin is not so much about our weaknesses, but about the strengths that we did not employ in order to love our neighbor. It's about the failure to even be aware of this sin. Sin is the failure to bother to love. When we think about this as a story of being God's provision, we cannot fail to be bothered. I think you can make a pretty good argument that the Christian life is a life invested in being bothered by Ruth and Naomi standing in front of you, desperate for somebody to see them. This is why when we hear about needs like we talked about last week, the transportation need with a middle school student at Booth who needs a ride to school and their family needs help getting their kid to school, we can't not do that. Surely we can't be so busy that we can't be bothered to help a family in need like that. This is why we have to do things like Fall Fest, which might seem silly on the surface, but think about what we are doing. There are people who desperately need just a few moments of respite, a few moments of joy for their family because things are just hard right now. This is why we show up. We can't not do that. We must be bothered enough to love the world around us. That's what we see from Boaz. That's the story that we see coming to life in Boaz and Ruth. And that story is far from over. I cannot wait to talk to you next week about the barley harvest and what it means that Boaz is next of kin. It's life-changing.